Good morning, everyone. So wonderful to see you all on this beautiful, beautiful day. And I'm assuming that there are some people who are probably out looking at fall colors or getting ready to. But welcome to the First Unitarian Church of Cincinnati. My name is Tim Krause, and I will serve as your worship leader today. I'm grateful to share this service with you this morning, both in person and online. Our congregation is a place where you can bring your whole self. Bring your full identity, your questioning mind, and your expansive heart. We are a community committed to social justice and to supporting the various spiritual and ethical paths of everyone who walks through these doors. Our congregation was founded in 1830, and we have worshiped in this building since 1889. We are grateful for this opportunity to be in this location, but we always want to recognize the fact that we do occupy stolen land. We have lived and benefited from the ancestors that have come before us and the ancient earthwork people who built mounds on this land that have been desecrated and destroyed. And we also recognize that this has been the ancestral land of the Miamia and the Shawnee people. This is the uncomfortable history that we must live in tension with all of the time and recognize that we still need to address these grievous wrongs. If you would like to know more about our church or about the Unitarian Universalist faith, please contact us by emailing member-care@firstuu.com. For those watching at home, this email address is in the description of today's service on your YouTube page. Our congregation strives to be welcoming to all, so you will see signs for various accommodations posted around the church and listed in the order of service. Our ushers would be glad to help answer any questions that you might have. Now, our flowers today are presented by Trish Hart and Janet Phillips in honor of their granddaughter, Kaylee Elizabeth, who was born July 22nd, 2023. It's always nice to have grandchildren come into our families, isn't it? So before we actually begin our service, we'd like for you all to rise as you're willing and able, and greet your neighbors, and also say hi to the people who are watching us on YouTube. I will bring us back together with the ringing of the singing bowl. As Chloe Nesbitt lights our chalice, I have a few words that are excerpted from Amanda Gorman's The Hill We Climb, which was the poem that was used in the most recent presidential inauguration. And Amanda says, "When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? When the day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light. If only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to be it. And now our opening hymn. We're going to sing When the Spirit Says Do. And so we'll rise if you're willing and able. We will sing hymn number 1024, When the Spirit Says Do. You know, we're getting a little better with that song. We have to keep up with the spirit that Jera puts out on the piano because she was on it. And now we have our message for all ages with Meredith.
Our story today has been told for millennia in the East. In some versions of this song, or in this story, there are 5 friends who are blind. In other versions of this story, they are blindfolded. In still other versions of the story, they are wandering around in the dark. And in every case, they don't have their sense of sight. So 5 friends without the sense of sight stumble upon a strange creature. One friend begins feeling along this creature and says, this creature, it kind of feels like a bit of rope. The other friend says, what are you talking about? This friend, or this creature feels like tree bark. This creature does not want to stand. Thank you. Another friend starts feeling and says, what do you mean? This creature, it feels like a boulder. Still, a fourth friend says, no, this creature, it feels like a palm leaf. And finally, the fifth friend says, no, this creature is like a thick snake. Elephant. And it was an elephant. It looks like a lion. This story reminds me of something that happens at my house quite a bit. At least once a week, Lily will come to me and say, Mom, why doesn't Sierra like the dark? I like the dark. Mom, why doesn't Sierra like it loud? I like it loud. Lily, what do I always say when you ask that? You don't remember? It's because you're different people. And certain versions of this story, the five friends encounter a wise person who ends up telling them that this is indeed an elephant. And says, you experience this elephant in different ways because you are different people. Like you and your sister. This is the nature of reality. We each experience it in different ways. I wonder what that means. Children, why don't you go ahead and join me in your classrooms?
So yesterday we had our second workshop on building beloved community. And as part of that workshop, I made a comment that the management of attention determines the reality of your life experience. Wherever your attention lands defines your reality in that moment. And I said, I could speak for hours on this topic, and someday I will. But not this morning. But this morning, I just wanted to point that out because if you do this exercise for the next minute, you will already get a sense of how choosing to manage your attention, choosing where your attention is placed, and for how long you place it there, literally does change your view of reality and your experience even of yourself. So our attention has been drawn into the wonder of this incredible, historic, beautiful, deeply meaningful sanctuary, and our voices, and those gathered with us, and the children. And so our attention's been pulled out of us. And this centering silence is about 60 seconds to say to yourself, let's take our attention and bring it back within us, place it within ourselves, so that we can be recentered in our own selves and try to stay present there for the remainder of the service. And the way you do that is simply by putting your attention on the phenomenon of your breath as your chest or your abdomen rises and falls while you breathe. So let's recenter with a little attention training on the breath.
Part of being a beloved community is sharing joys and concerns with each other. If you would like to share something with the congregation, please complete the form on the back of your bulletin. And then you can place it in the offering basket as you leave the sanctuary today, and then that notification will be sent to either Reverend Mary Tarbell Green or to Dr. Alex for them to read and address. And then it will also go to other people if we want to, if it is decided to share that with the whole congregation. Our October Share the Plate offering is with the Shiloh Food Bank. For several years now, our congregation has been partnering with the Shiloh Food Bank to assist families in need of additional food. Your contributions will go directly to supporting the people with great need. And to talk real briefly about what Shiloh does, we've got two guests, Richard Foster and Harriet Martin Grace, who would like to share a few words with us about the Shiloh Food Bank. So, Richard, Harriet, thank you for being here with us.
Good morning. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to be here to greet everybody this morning, to see the people that help us do various things. We got a lot of volunteers that come from your church, and it has been good. The relationship has been good. I got a few numbers of things that has happened during the year since 2022. We have served over 1,550 different households with about 4,040 individuals. They visited us for food over 7,100 times. We have distributed at least 250 pounds of food, enough for about 150 meals, and we share surplus donated to us to other pantries. And that is also accredited to you also. I want to thank you.
Good morning. Once again, you've seen me before. I'm no stranger. But I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. Anyone who has ever volunteered at the pantry, stand up. Let the church see your beautiful faces. Stand up. Stand up. These are the people who help make the pantry work. Thank you so much. We have a woman that came in. Her daughter was on crack cocaine, and she dropped off 4 children to her grandmother, to their grandmother. So the grandmother decided, am I going to pay rent or am I going to buy food? Rent or food? She found out about the pantry. And when she came, we do pantry choice, so she was able to pick what the children needed for food. And when she left, she said, thank you. My children will have milk, they will have cereal, they will have meat, produce, veggies. Kids don't like veggies, but she was so appreciative. And it meant a lot to us. And a lot of times when I ask the volunteers, how do you feel about it? They said, it makes us feel so good that people don't have to go to bed hungry at night. Now, if I go to bed hungry at night, it's simply because I don't cook. But some people go to bed hungry because they have no food. And because of the pantry, we make this possible. So let's just look at our hearts and just realize how blessed we are to help others. Thank you.
We want to thank the two of you and all of the people at Shiloh for being such an inspiration to us as well. I mean, it's your inspiration that started this partnership, and we are so very, very grateful for that. So thank you very much. If you are inspired to donate to Shiloh to support the work of First Church, there are several methods of giving. These are listed in the order of service, and there are links in the description of today's service on the YouTube channel for folks watching online. Just click on More at the end of the sermon description. If you're visiting with us for the first time, please let the plate pass you by. Your presence is gift enough.
Jera. Thank you for that. Our next hymn is number 121, We'll Build a Land, in the gray hymnal. Please turn to it and rise as you are able. Well, good morning. If you haven't noticed yet, I'm a rather casual preacher. So a music stand is enough if it gets me closer to y'all. And in my previous congregation, there were mornings where I wanted to sit while I preached, and I had a stool that was yay tall. That one won't quite do it. But I find myself a stool, and some days I may even sit down on a stool and preach to y'all. Or I might even bring in my lazy boy. All right. They fixed the clock. Yeah, they fixed the clock. Now, is that applause for the clock or for the fact that now I have no excuse to go overtime? No, I have an excuse left, you know. When the Spirit moves you, the Spirit moves you, and you ain't done till the Spirit's done. But usually I'll go by the clock. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. This is the introduction to Paul Revere's Ride by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So last week I did a sermon where I just talked in the abstract about narrative. What is narrative? And I used history as an example of narrative. And at the end of that sermon, I left you with a thought to ponder. I had said, basically, in that sermon, that narrative, according to the postmodern philosopher Mark Taylor, with whom I agree, is the imaginative construction. The imaginative construction of the narrator or the historian, weaved between certain fixed points that the narrator or the historian gets to choose. So narrative is imaginative construction weaved between certain fixed points, which the narrator, or in last week's instance, the historian, gets to choose. And the point of that sermon was to encourage us to question narratives, whether it be history or the narratives that are spun on the evening news. Narratives are everywhere. And we tend not to question them a whole lot, especially when they confirm our bias. But we should question narrative. Who's the narrator? What fixed points is that person choosing? Why and toward what end? We should be suspicious of narrative. So the question I left you with is just to ask yourselves, whose interest does a narrative serve? And what is that interest? And sticking with history as our example of narrative, whose interest does a particular historical story serve? And toward what end? Inversely stated, in a given narrative, whose interest is not being served? This is very important. Every time you hear a narrative, it's a particular point of view, which means, by definition, it excludes other points of view. Whose interest is not being served, and toward what end is that interest not being served? This is especially true with history. So, for example, let's consider Paul Revere's ride again. Who was Paul Revere? Well, yes, he was a wealthy white male. And like many other wealthy white males, be they businessmen or landowners or politicians of the time, history tends to weave itself through the stories of people like that. But whose interest does the Paul Revere Ride poem not tell? The British, the poor, the natives. You're getting the idea. And it doesn't tell the story of Wentworth Cheswell. Right? You all know who Wentworth Cheswell was, right? You've never heard of Wentworth Cheswell? Have you heard of Wentworth Cheswell? Anybody ever hear of Wentworth Cheswell? Good Lord, I wonder why. You think it's possible that it's because he wasn't white? He was a black man. The first black man elected to office in the United States of America. And nobody knows who he was. And on the same evening Paul Revere took his ride, he went to warn people in the North that the British are coming. Now look at the cover of your order of service. That's Mr. Wentworth Cheswell. How in the world does nobody know who this man is, the first black man elected to office in the United States and who made as an important sacrifice and ride on the night that Paul Revere did? How come he does not have a story? Whose story is not being told? This is what I mean when I say narratives have an agenda. They tell a particular story toward a particular end, and they don't tell other stories toward a particular end. What about Sybil Ludington? You know who Sybil Ludington was? Who? Raise your hand. Somebody knows. You know. Who was Sybil Ludington? That's right, a 16-year-old girl who rode south on the same night as Paul Revere to warn about the British. You've earned a cup of coffee. And how come only one person in this congregation this morning, which I guess represents about 1% of us, know who Sybil Ludington is? A woman. Why don't we know why don't we know her story? Because she ain't a white male. You get where I'm going with narrative? Everybody knows the American narrative through the fixed point of the experience of the white males and the imaginative construction historians weave through that experience to tell you the history of America. And the accepted history of America is largely the story of wealthy white males. You see a problem there? I see a problem there. So whose story's not being told when historians are busy telling the story of wealthy white males? I heard a few. Women, natives, the poor. Who else? Blacks? All non-white people. Children. Animals, the LGBT community, the non-binary community, immigrants. Do you see how a narrative is exclusionary by definition? And whatever is excluded from a narrative gets lost to history. And the narrative that survives defines history. And to the extent that it is accepted as an accurate narrative of history, and it generally is because we don't know how to question narrative, it becomes sacred. It becomes sacred. And that's why certain folks are pushing back against those who would like to begin to include more intentionally the story of non-white people in the history of America. They're defending what they consider to be a sacred narrative about the United States of America. You see how important this is? So the omissions from a narrative preserve the sacred character of narrative, which is why we fight so much about narratives. When you truly believe the narrative you've been told is the way things are, it's sacred. And anybody who pushes back on that is challenging your reality. It may be history. It may be religion. Every religion's narrative is pretty different from every other religion's narrative. And we wonder why we have religious strife in the world. Because everybody's protecting the sacredness of their narrative. If we're going to move forward as a collective people, we need to maybe reconsider how ensconced the narratives we know that have defined our reality really are. Maybe even begin to deconstruct them and recreate them in a way that is radically inclusive. And if we can't do that much, we're always going to be at loggerheads with one another, about how the story should be written. So, you've named a lot of the groups that are not included in the accepted American historical narrative. And we could talk at this point about any one of those groups and make the point I'm about to make. But I want to take a minute and talk about the Black experience. And this may be uncomfortable for some folks, but it's an example of what we need to be able to talk about. If we're going to do the work of reconciliation and radical inclusivity and move forward together as one beautifully, exquisitely diverse group of one people. So let's talk about the Black narrative for a minute. Maybe we can do this by reverse engineering the story of Philando Castile. Do you know who he was? You know who Philando was? Philando, I think it was the beginning of COVID, was the man who was shot to death sitting in his car after having been stopped by a cop who simply asked for his driver's license. This was on YouTube Live. His girlfriend was recording this, was sending this out over YouTube Live. So there's no debate about the facts of the matter. Philando posed absolutely no threat to the cop that shot him to death. Go back and watch it. And I said to myself, maybe finally there's going to be some racial reckoning in this country. Maybe white people are going to see this and finally be so aghast at the experience of Black people in this country that maybe they're going to start participating in some meaningful racial dialogue and justice making. Did not happen. Did not happen. When George Floyd was killed, it happened for a while. It happened for a while. But if we go back to Philando or George Floyd, or any unnamed Black man who's been unarmed and killed by authorities, there have been many. And we reverse engineer that story. What happens? So you see a Black man who gets killed. Why did that happen? Do you know how many times Philando was pulled over by the cops in his life? Take a guess. Dozens. 49 times. I don't think I know a white person who's been pulled over 4 times. 49 times. And I'm guessing the vast majority of those were for the crime of driving while Black. So what Philando represents is a narrative that Black men in this country have to face every day. That there is a serious white bias against Black males. And Black women. And Asian males and Asian women, and you get the point. But let's stick with the Black experience now. How did this white bias against Black males develop? Do we know the history here? Why is it 1 in 4 Black males are likely to be incarcerated at some point in their life? Why? They suffer the myth of Black maleness that was created decades, even a century earlier. Y'all saw Dennis preach on Birth of a Nation, right? We got to teach white America to be afraid of Black males. This teaching has been going on for a century, ever since emancipation. And the message has been for a century, Black men are dangerous. Black men are coming for your women. Black men are violent. They must be controlled. Y'all know this, right? Because if you all don't know this, we're doing some serious Zoom time together. This is serious stuff. Why did that happen? Why did that happen? After emancipation, the white world went to war with blackness, but especially black males. I mean, good Lord, what happened right after emancipation? Which amendment got passed? 14th and 13th. And the 13th Amendment says what? Did you all watch 13, the documentary? Do you remember this? If you don't remember this or you haven't seen it, go watch it. The 13th Amendment has a clause that forced labor shall not be permitted except in the case of incarceration. You know our 13th Amendment says that? Sorry, I'm getting a little worked up. Because it's audacious. And so, if you can only force labor on people who are incarcerated, what's the easy solution to the loss of slave labor? Incarcerate black men. So we pass laws, trivial laws, that we know members of the black community will violate. So we can justify putting them in prison, putting them back in slavery, and forcing labor on them. And the ones who don't end up prison, we're going to teach you to fear. I know I say narrative is a lot of imaginative construction. There's not a lot of imagination here, folks. This is all objective history. So we were taught to fear blackness, and we were especially taught to fear black men. Good Lord, why? Let's take black history back a little further. Are you uncomfortable? It's hard to hear this, isn't it? It's hard to hear this. If you're white, I hope you feel some guilt. And if you're black, I'm guessing you're probably thinking, yeah, we know most of this. That's a problem. A lot of white people don't know this stuff. So, emancipation happens, we incarcerate black men, force them back into labor, or we teach people to fear black men, and we don't make livable wage jobs available to black people. Where black people congregate, we move the jobs into districts that are redlined, where they can't buy the homes to live, to work in the jobs. Right? We know this history. Now, go back. Slavery. How did that happen? How did slavery happen? How did we get slaves in America? Kidnapping. We kidnapped people from Africa, brought them to America, stripped them of name, tribal identification, religion, any sense of self that they might have brought with them. And we stripped Africans of an identity so they could be broken and put to service for white, wealthy, male purposes. That's not imagination. That's what we did. That's what happened back then. There's a lot more to the black narrative, folks, but those are some significant pieces of it. And so, is it any surprise if you start in Africa and you move that story forward, that Philando Castile is sitting there dead, shot by a white cop in his car? A symbol of the black experience in America. That's what Philando Castile was. This goes on all the time. Okay. So when we hear the narrative of America being told, we hear a narrative of America of the wealthy white male experience. And by definition, it excludes the black experience. It excludes the Asian experience. It excludes the female experience. It excludes the gay experience. And it's virtually unassailable because so many white people think it tells the truth and therefore it is sacred. That's what the fight about history in America is all about these days. And I think all of us, not just white folks, but black folks and Asian folks, Hispanic folks, not just straight folks, gay folks, binary folks, non-binary folks, we need to know these stories, and we need to start telling them, all of us together, and move toward a narrative that is radically inclusive of everybody whose story hasn't been told yet. Does that make sense? Can I get an amen? Amen. Give me two more, because I've lost my spot, and I got to get back to, I got on a roll. All right. So let's do this. You ever read W.E.B. Du Bois? I mean, seriously, have you read, not like have you seen a quote from him? Have you read W.E.B. Du Bois? Not enough of us. Have you read The Souls of Black Folk? Souls in the plural. Sometimes I give homework during a sermon, and I don't usually mean it or expect you to do it. I mean this, and I hope you do it. It's not a big read. Go read The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois, because in there, he introduces a concept that explains the problem with different narratives. The white narrative and his experience of the black narrative, or more directly, the white experience and his experience as a black man. What I'm about to read to you is a paragraph long, but what he says is a perfect capstone to what I've been trying to say for the last 15 minutes. And it doesn't just apply to people who are black. It applies to everyone who doesn't experience themselves as being part of white privilege and supremacy. See, if you're part of white privilege, you don't have to think about your experience, because your experience is a given to you. You take it for granted. And you don't have to figure out what it's like to live in a world where you don't have privilege and notions of supremacy. You don't have to think about that. W.E.B. Du Bois says everybody else has to think about that, because you got to live in that world and your world. So he coined the term double consciousness. And it goes like this from The Souls of Black Folk. After the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and the Roman, the Teuton and the Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world. Catch that. Gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. I'm a very passionate man. This is so heartbreaking, I have to stop and breathe for a minute. My empathy goes out to anybody who has this experience, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, which is a way of saying your sense of self, your identity, your self-understanding, you don't determine it. It's determined how you think others perceive you. Where's the inherent worth and dignity in that? Sorry, I'm getting worked up again. This sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness. An American, a Negro. Two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. God bless the soulful resilience of the black experience in America. There is a depth of courage and fortitude in these words that white people never have to find within themselves. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife. That's what I mean by two narratives. That's the strife. The white narrative and the non-white narrative. And people who aren't part of the power structure, the privilege, the supremacy, are always having to be conscious of these two different narratives, these two different realities. How do you know when to show up as who in a world where there are double expectations? That's what Du Bois is telling us. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. Wouldn't we want everyone to be their better and truer self? And the message Du Bois is giving us here is the point of the sermon. Until there is one collective narrative of the exquisite beauty and value of a diverse human population, until that narrative includes everybody, or to the extent in which it doesn't, people will never feel a sense of belonging and that they can act from their true self. Always having to act wondering how the other is going to respond to you prevents your own authenticity, your own sense of identity, your own sense of personal worth and power and meaning in life. That's why this is so important. And the racial justice that this congregation's committed to. Were you around when you voted 100% for the eighth principle? The commitment of this congregation to do racial justice in this world is dependent on us reconstructing a narrative that is radically inclusive of each and every person. So that people no longer have to live a double consciousness. So people can feel they belong in the narrative. They have a sense of self in the narrative. They are valued because they are in the narrative. They can stand within their own true, authentic being and show up in the world and be who they are. Now think about that for a minute. Can you imagine a more beautiful world than everybody being able to show up as their true, authentic self, be who they are? And through the radical diversity of the human race, together create something meaningful and synergistic and beautiful? That's the narrative that needs to be written, and we can't write it until we overcome the old one. Each of us must learn other people's narratives at a deep level. All of us. And each of us must be willing to and able to tell everybody's narrative at a deep level so that the rest of the world begins to hear. That's where racial justice and reconciliation begins, in my mind. All right, let me close out. Oh, pull the battery out of that clock. All right, I just said that. All right, I'm darn close to done. So you're all going to go home and read W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls, plural, of black folk, by next week. I'll give you 2 weeks, because next week I'm not in the pulpit. But on the 15th, I want you all to be able to raise your hand. It's a quick read. But also, probably the most important history book I've ever read was Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. How many of you have read that book? Oh, not enough of us. All right. It's a must read for any conscientious person who wants to do this work. The title is self-explanatory. A People's History, not a privileged white male history. A people's history of the United States. And he gets in to the historical points and narratives of non-white males that needs to be told. So you will be getting an email from me in the next 72 hours inviting you into an online book study. And we're going to go through this book. I did this with the League of Women Voters in Detroit, man. I'll tell you, what a fantastic book study and conversation that was. Right? Ramona, you watched it. You watched it. Powerful work. And I hope as many of you as possible sign up. I hope so many of you sign up that I have to do it twice. Like, let's have 2 groups of 20 or 3 groups of 20 and begin to really dig into the narratives that need to be told. And here's where I think we begin to write the new narrative. I once did a children's message for all ages on race, and I found these poems that were written by some black poets for children, and I shared these poems. And I tried to find that poem yesterday. I couldn't find it. But there was a line in one poem which to me makes me say, yes, amen. That's the foundation of this work. And the poem just ends with, we're all golden on the inside. We are all golden on the inside. And let's weave a narrative around that. All right, thank you. I took 5 extra minutes, but blessed be musical reflection, and we'll draw our service to a close.
We surely do live in an age of Reconstruction. As William Barber clearly indicates, we are in the middle of a 3rd Reconstruction. There was the one right after the Civil War. There was the one of the Civil Rights Movement, and we are in a 3rd Reconstruction. Sometimes it takes 3 times to get it right. Let's hope that we can get it right this 3rd Reconstruction. Now, please join me in reading together the words that will appear on the screen as we extinguish our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment that we carry in our hearts until we are together again. And before we start our postlude, I want to remind everyone that we have a potluck today. It's the first Sunday of the month, and even if you didn't bring anything or prepare anything, don't worry. Everybody's welcome at this table. Please come. And because we're doing the potluck, we want to try to keep the receiving line after the service with Alex shorter, and we can do some of that conversation in the potluck, okay? So, keeping in mind we are in the third Reconstruction. Thank you, Joe.